Alrighty guys, it is Kwame here today, also known as Detective Q, and if you have not seen Dragon Ball Super episode 121, leave now, as this video will contain massive spoilers, and it will also compare these massive spoilers to a lot of things that you have seen in the past of Dragon Ball. So without wasting any more time, let's get straight into this video and let's talk about episode 121. So, for all of you who have seen this episode, there's a lot of stuff that went on, and a lot of people are talking about the references that were actually going on in this episode. A lot of people are comparing Aniraza to Hatchiyack, a lot of people are comparing Aniraza to Janemba. But what if I told you that Aniraza is not only a Hatchiyack reference and a reference to Janemba, but is also a reference to other characters and other moments from A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans and other Dragon Ball movies? So without wasting any more time, I'm going to go in depth with all of the different references of Aniraza and explain them all to you today. So let's get this party started. So the first thing we have to do is actually just reference Aniraza's appearance itself. Now this one is quite simple. It's pretty obvious that by looking at Aniraza, he's clearly based off of the Hatchiyack design when you look at the green orb that's on his body in conjunction with having a very similar eye shape to both Hatchiyack and Janemba. So design wise, we can clearly say that there's inspirations with both Hatchiyack and Janemba there. And one thing that I think is a slight comparison that we can make in this video is to look at Paparoni and to look at Dr. Raichi from A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans. Both of them have a purplish blue skin tone, and interestingly enough, Paparoni actually has a monocle on one of his eyes, whereas Dr. Raichi actually had one of his eyes actually tinted out. But the more interesting thing about Paparoni's design is that although he slightly looks like Dr. Raichi, his design is actually based more from Dr. Tenma from the Astro Boy series, if those of you who have not known that. So he's clearly more of a reference to Dr. Tenma in terms of his actual design, but he does loosely resemble Dr. Raichi, and it is interesting that in both A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans and in this episode of Dragon Ball Super, that both of them had a doctor that preceded Aniraza and Hatchiyack actually coming out. Now that we got the apparent stuff out of the way, we also have to talk about some other interesting comparisons. One of them is the fact that, very similar to Super Android 13, Aniraza was born with the absorption of multiple characters. So this is somewhat of a movie reference to Super Android 13, where we see that after 14 and 15 were defeated, they were absorbed into Super Android 13, and he started giving all of the Z fighters a hard time as they were all fighting against him. Interestingly enough, MJ, Mario Jimmy, actually pointed out that as the episode was proceeding, there was a point of the episode where Aniraza actually grew wings, and the only time that we've ever seen this in a Dragon Ball Z movie would be obviously when Hirudegarn grew wings when he was fighting against Goku and all of his friends in Wrath of the Dragon. So right there we have a reference to Super Android 13, and we also have a reference to Wrath of the Dragon. Now, here's something that I found really interesting. When we analyze the actual attacks, and this is something that we have to take a direct reference to Fusion Reborn with here, we see that Aniraza uses the dimensional bending like punches the same way that Janemba was using them against Goku in Fusion Reborn. If you guys remember, Janemba had the ability to just punch, and his punch went through like a dimensional phase and managed to hit Goku from behind. And I found this very interesting because we've never really seen a villain in any Dragon Ball movie, or really in the Dragon Ball series, that is able to just shoot punches and their punches just pop out of nowhere. I guess you could say to some degree with the time skip hits abilities are somewhat similar to this, but it's nowhere near the exact same way that Janemba was using in the Fusion Reborn movie. So clearly, attack wise, that was definitely a nod there to Janemba. And I should also point out that when we look at the way that Aniraza was attacking many of the characters, it is very interesting that there's a direct similarity with A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans and Hatchiyack, where there was a sequence in which Hatchiyack managed to simultaneously just wipe out all of the Z Fighters all at once, the same way that Aniraza was able to put down Goku and all of his friends at once, where 17 was actually theorizing how he's able to even do such a thing while multiple people are actually fighting him all at once. So, although a plan to eradicate the Saiyans didn't give an explanation for it the same way the Dragon Ball Super did, that simultaneous attack was something that was done in both. And it was also somewhat done in Super Android 13 as well, when they were all ganging up on him. Now, Dragon Ball Super was original at certain points here, and I will give them credit for this. First of all, one of the things that we have to talk about here is that it's not a direct reference to a plan to eradicate the Saiyans in terms of its plot, and it's definitely not a reference to any of the movies in terms of its plot, because if you look at this episode, Aniraza is essentially just this mindless monster that's born with Dr. Paparoni just absorbing all of his robots along with himself and creating this creature out of nowhere. So there's no plan or revenge plot to take the Saiyans down for what they did to the Tuffle race. This is all just an original creature that's just mindless and just attacking out of rage. So that's clearly something original here. And also, if I were to point out something about Android 17, and the explanation for how Aniraza is able to actually fight all of the characters at once, it is very interesting to point out that as the animal expert, Android 17 is actually comparing the way Aniraza is using those antennas on the top of his head to a dolphin who's actually using echolocation. And I found that that was very interesting how he made the comparison between a bat and a dolphin in this episode. So 17 and his knowledge of animals is definitely something that added towards this episode of Dragon Ball Super. And when we talk more about the actual weakness of Aniraza versus the actual weakness of Hatchiyack, there was a big difference here that went on. So if we go back to a plan to eradicate the Saiyans, the way that they figured out his weakness is that every 15 seconds when he was about to attack, he was actually vulnerable to actually fire your attack again. So if you guys remember going back to both versions of A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans, the Raging Blast remake along with the original remake from the Dragon Ball Z Gaiden video game for the Nintendo Famicom, you guys would remember that the way that they powered up is that right before Hatchiyack powered up his attack on that 15th second, they all fired their energy blast. But this time, the way the weakness was figured out is that 17 essentially did it all by himself, as 18 sacrificed herself for him to actually continue fighting, and he actually went straight through the energy blast and attacked his actual core, which was referred to as his energy reactor, which actually distracted him and allowed all of the other characters to power up their beams and to eventually finish him off. So they changed the way that the weakness was for Dragon Ball Super, and in addition to this, the way the sacrifice was in Dragon Ball Super is actually quite interesting. So two characters made a big sacrifice in this episode. We have Android 17 and we have Android 18. 17 essentially just threw himself into harm's way so that Goku and his friends could power up their beams to finish off Aniraza. Whereas originally in A Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans, after everybody was severely beaten up by Hatchiyack, Goku actually charges Hatchiyack to give the others time to power up their energy so they could all do that beam clash, whereas 17 in this case was the one who actually charged blindly against, Aniraza to give the others time. That was a change that they made there, and interestingly enough, if we look at another sacrifice, this is actually dealing directly with the original Plan to Eradicate the Saiyans and not the Raging Blast remake. Piccolo actually sacrificed himself to try and save Gohan from one of Hatchiyack's energy blasts. So essentially Piccolo sacrificed himself in a way of trying to save Gohan's life, and he told Gohan to give a senzu bean to everybody so that they could continue fighting. And Piccolo told Gohan that he was not going to use a senzu bean for himself and that he wanted Gohan to use all the senzu beans to help his friends. So Piccolo essentially sacrificed himself so that the others could have senzu beans and to power up. And this is very similar to how Android 18 sacrificed herself for Android 17 to continue fighting in the Tournament of Power, because she felt that obviously 17 was a much stronger character and could contribute much more to Universe 7 actually defeating Aniraza. So there was a sacrifice between both Piccolo and Android 18 in both the original plan to eradicate the Saiyans. Remember, the original plan to eradicate the Saiyans, not the Raging Blast remake, and from what we saw in Dragon Ball Super. So definitely, that is definitely something we have to add there. But I should point out that for the Raging Blast remake, Piccolo was involved in the beam clash and fired a Makanko Suppo special beam cannon to actually help out against Hatchiyack. So for whatever reason, they made Piccolo join in on the final clash in the Raging Blast remake, but in the original plan to eradicate the Saiyans, Piccolo was just a spectator. And yes, guys, obviously, you can take a guess which ending I preferred. So, if I were to point out the final major similarity between a plan to eradicate the Saiyans and this Hatchiyack Aniraza-like episode, it would be the final showdown. So essentially, the final showdown is almost exactly the same, with all of the characters just joining in, firing their energy beams, and finishing off Aniraza the same way that Hatchiyack was defeated in a plan to eradicate the Saiyans. And if there was something else that I think is just a direct side-by-side shot, there was one shot where Goku was firing a Kamehameha that looks identical to an exact shot from the original plan to eradicate the Saiyans when he was firing a Kamehameha right before he finished off Hatchiyack. So the series of Dragon Ball Super is definitely making a direct comparison to a plan to eradicate the Saiyans, even with direct picture shots side by side, if you can see the image on the screen here. So, and if I were to point out a little weird thing that kind of piqued my interest outside of the final showdown, it would be the sequence in which Android 18 was almost eaten by Aniraza. And the weird thing about this is that I was saying to myself, if Aniraza ate 18, although she would have been killed, essentially Universe 3 would have been disqualified anyways if we assumed that 18 was going to be killed as she was being eaten. So that was definitely something I was thinking about, but obviously as a mindless monster, Aniraza probably didn't care. And it was also weird how Aniraza is a combination of all of these robots along with Dr. Paparoni, but doesn't really have, like, I guess you could say, an intellectual sense to be aware that by eating 18, he would actually cause his entire universe to be erased anyway. So that was definitely just an extra note that I wanted to add. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you guys learned a lot about, you know, some old aspects of Dragon Ball history, because I actually had to go back and rewatch a lot of those scenes before I actually did this video today to give you a direct comparison. And I have a big shout out to MJ and Mario Jamie for actually helping me with this video itself. So with everything else said, please remember to rate, comment, and subscribe. And remember, as I always said, have a great day, guys. And if you noticed any other similarities, say so in the comment section below.